Good morning and welcome to this, the second in the series of DORA Deep Dives, the second of 5. My name is George Joyce and I'll be your host today. I'm joined by my colleague Fiona Kiley, who is our expert on research on all things regulations. I'm going to assume that most of you are familiar with DORA at this stage and have been working on projects, plural, to be ready for January the 17th next year. So I'm going to assume that today is like a check for you to see if you're on course. I'm sure you don't want any surprises now or in January 2025. I'm not claiming any superior knowledge. I've read the Act and the guidance as you have, I'm sure, but I hope my analysis will give you some reassurance that you're on the right track. Okay, so if you have tough questions for me, I have Fiona along my side, and hopefully between the two of us, we can give you an answer or at least an opinion on it. Okay, let's get started. Very briefly, there's a couple of you on the webinar who haven't been on previous webinars, so brief introductions, who we are, very brief DORA overview just to set the scene, and then we'll get into the meat of it. We'll talk first about what's in the Act regarding third parties, then the regulatory technical standards that were published recently, and then the one that everybody loves is the Register of Information. Okay, and so we'll leave some time at the end for Q&A. Okay, who are we? We're calQrisk. The company is called calQrisk, and the product is called calQrisk. We designed and we deliver a simply called a GRC, a Governance, Risk and Compliance solution. It includes a DORA-specific solution within it, if that's all you wanted. Happy to do demos at any time. We see ourselves as experts like you in compliance and risk management. We're members of various institutions and try to keep our skills sharp by, being members and also by contact with our customers. We also offer risk advisory service where people don't have maybe the skills in-house themselves. I think most of you are probably those experts in your own companies. Yeah, I think I need to update. We've been growing quite rapidly over the last 3 years, and we have. I must really update this figure because I know that the ID of users now is quite high. So anyway, used a lot in the financial services sector primarily. We do have some housing associations and charities, but I'd say it's probably 80% in the financial services space. That's us. As usual, my quote, a quote, and this time I went to Mother Teresa for a quote. I like this one. I can do things you cannot, you can do things I cannot, and together we do great things, or we can do great things. Now, I think we all accept that in business, it's inevitable that we work with third parties. So let's make sure that that partnership is a robust one. Okay. There's nothing new, hopefully, for any of you here in this. It's a regulation applies to all European member states. It came into force nearly 2 years ago. It becomes applicable. I'm not sure what into force means when it's not applicable, but there you go. You have 2 years to be preparing for January the 17th, so no excuses will be accepted by the regulator. Now, they did only produce their own goods really I would say in the last few months, but there were drafts available. So again, they will be expecting you to be ready. And from the dry run and from people who've attended, and we have some customers who are participated in that, the sense I get is that there is no room for an extension or grace period after January the 17th. So hopefully your projects are on track. I summarized DORA to people, even people who aren't, let's say, obliged to do DORA, said that it's about making ICT systems, that's information communications technologies systems that support financial business, making them better in the sense that they're more secure to cyber attacks, that they're less likely to fail. And that's not just fail through attacks, but can be hardware and software failures, faster to get back up and running. And that's kind of the essence of resilience, that you get back up again quickly. Or a good resilient organization who have plans in place will get back up and running in minutes rather than hours. If they have good processes and procedures. The encouraging thing is that it harmonizes and improves maybe several guidelines that have been in operation for years already. So I could say you should be doing a lot of this stuff already. You probably have been doing a lot of this stuff. It's maybe just organizing it slightly differently. There might be a few additions and a little bit more detail in things like policies. It's all for the good. There's nothing in DORA that I would say is nonsense. It's certainly very good. But if you're a smaller financial entity, it might seem onerous. But look, the proportionality principle always applies. We'll talk about that more as we go through it. Okay. Yeah, I think one important thing that I picked out, and I mentioned this the last time as well, that you can't mitigate every risk by just having a bit more money in the bank, and we pay for that. No, the regulator wants you to be resilient and not to be impacting the customers, and no amount of money will change their mind on that. You have to have good, resilient systems, basically. Okay. I'm not sure who first coined the phrase on the DORA 5 pillars, but that's what we're using, and we're on number 2 today. And today it's about ICT third-party risk management, which is an integral part, you could say, of your risk management. So we'll have a look at that. We'll start with, and we'll talk about the technical standards and then the Register of Information afterwards. But first of all, we start with the Act. And I've just picked out these 8 articles where the third parties are referenced. I haven't picked out every single reference, but I'm hoping I've picked out the essence of it. So I think the Act has been there for 2 years. The technical standards and the Register of Information, the implementing those technical standards, that's more recent. And it built on the requirements for the Act. The Act is the legal bit. And the first 3 here, Articles 5, 6, and 8, are really about governance things. I would say, even though the first one is called governance and organization, I think they all are. The policy, and this, as you read through the Act and read through the technical standards, you realize the policy is the kernel to everything. And as I read it, I've always liked short policies, but you won't get away with a short policy in this one. It needs detail. Detailed. If you're a large organization, there will be even more detail in there on your position on things, on when do you outsource, under what conditions, and who will you outsource to, and what are the requirements you would expect. And all of that detail has to be in a policy somewhere. The arrangements, what you would expect, and again, it goes into detail down to the level of information security. And I would be saying, yes, the information security of your third party should be certainly commensurate with the criticality of what you're outsourcing, but it should certainly reflect your own information security standard that you set. It should be aligned with that, shall we say. Like with any good governance, there needs to be somebody identified to be responsible at a senior level, and probably, depending on the organization, it might be at board level and it might be at senior management level, but certainly responsibilities need to be clear. And reporting, again, specified in the policy. How often will you report? What will you report on? Were there additional third parties added? Were there ones who've been terminated? Were there ones who've been failing? Performance reporting. All of that you need to decide. All of it is important and probably is mandated. Just the extent and the detail, I think proportionality principle. We talked about the risk management framework in the last one, so I won't go into detail, but in the ICT risk management framework, again, policies, protocols, processes and procedures, multi-vendor strategy. If you have multiple vendors, what is your strategy? What is your rationale for outsourcing? Explain it to yourself. Be convinced yourself that it is the right thing for you to do. If you can't write the rationale, then you won't convince anybody else. What is your operational resilience strategy? Is it aligned with the organizational objectives? And I think I've said this in a few seminars. Often ICT, one of the biggest sins an ICT person can commit probably is not being aligned with the organizational objectives. ICT supports, it's a support function. It's not a leading function. the business decides the direction it wants to go in ICT, the ICT department, if you wish, and the ICT strategy should support that. And all of these policies and all of these things you've set in stone have to be reviewed because the world changes. You only have to look at the news once a week, and you think that's different to last week. So plan to change the policy at least once a year. Identification in the Act that says, identify dependent processes. And really DORA is about focusing on those critical or important services that you offer and the impact that the disruption to those could have on your organization, on other organizations, but mainly on the clients, so the customers. So identify those, identify what the Act calls the interconnections, because if you're identifying third parties that are you require to deliver a service, I think you need to identify maybe fourth parties that are dependent on this, and maybe those third parties are supporting multiple processes and services. You need to be fully aware of all of that interconnectedness. When it comes to third parties, you need to know that if they're supporting a critical service, what are their business continuity plans? And do they match your needs? If you think about the business impact analysis, if you have to have your service back up in 2 hours, well, you need to make sure that your service provider has plans that also mean they'll be back in 2 hours. So make sure they're aligned with yours. We'll be doing more on testing in a few weeks. I think it's the fourth pillar, but advanced testing of ICT tools systems. TLPT is threat-led penetration testing. You need to identify the systems that need to be tested, basically, and then you need to test them. And you do need participation probably from the third parties because it might be their systems that need to be tested. And maybe there's multiple financial entities that need to know the results of that testing. Well, they're not all going to require an individual test. You can pool that, and they do talk about pooling that. For example, we do a pen test in our system, and customers often ask for a summary of that report. Happy to share it, but it's done by an independent third party. And again, that's in here as well, that for some systems it is a requirement that the pen test is done independently, but I think most people do that anyway. Article 28, this is where it gets meaty. The 28, if you're only going to read 2 of these, or reread them, I'd say, do 28 and 30. 28 is the general principles. This is where it's a longer article and good detail about managing third-party risk, about the register of information, about contractual arrangements, and about exit planning. But look, I'm not going to go through the general principles on managing risk. It's in there, but consider the third parties. When you outsource something to a third party, the control is at arm's length now. You don't have direct control over things, so it brings risks. If they fail, do you fail? You need to consider a lot of those risks to how it might disrupt the service. So you're going into that agreement with your eyes open. And if you're already in the agreement, as most are, it's maybe time for review. And would you do it again? Or maybe you need to bring it back in-house before it breaks. Concentration risk is a very short article, but yeah, know where you have concentration risk. If you have a lot of services outsourced to one provider, if they fail, a lot of your services fail. If they're outsourcing to a fourth party, and many financial entities have outsourced and maybe not realized that the fourth party now becomes the single point of failure. Well, the regulator is more interested in that, but I think you are as well, because it affects your industry. So be aware. Ignorance is not a defense. Never a defense. Key contractual provisions. We could spend a whole half hour on what's in a robust contract, but look, read Article 30. It's a lot of sense, a lot of, I would say, experience has gone into writing that. The rights and obligations, kind of obvious things. What are your obligations under this contract, and what are your rights to check? What are your what functions are you outsourcing or services? What locations are acceptable? And this needs to be in the policy. Maybe you say it has to stay within the European Union. you need to find out, and you need to make sure that your third party isn't outsourcing to a fourth party who are outside of the EU, if that's your policy. Information security requirements in the contract, absolutely. Service level agreements, cooperation. The regulator will always write this in. If they're coming and investigating, they want to make sure your contract with your third party forces the third party to cooperate with the regulator. Standard clause, I think. Termination, and the best time to talk about termination is when you're drawing up that contract, so it's clear and it's unemotional and agreed. Awareness programs. If you're a big financial entity with good information security awareness programs, and you're working with a smaller third party, maybe you can include them in your awareness training program. You would hope that the third parties have their own awareness training programs, but consider them an extension of your organization. Notice periods has to be clear in the contract. Personal experience in a previous life, looking at 24 contracts, I would say that it was fuzzy in half of them. So make it clear. Business continuity plans, again, in the contract requirement. Performance monitoring, that you will monitor, how often you will monitor, the reports you will get, reports on incidents. Yeah, even if they're fixed quickly, I would demand to know from a third party if there have any incidents, even if they were minor. Okay, and exit strategies. This is probably, again, I know the last time there were a few questions, and we might come to that on exit strategies and how do you test them. We'll cover that under the questions. Okay, and now the how. And the how is in from the regulator in the Regulatory Technical Standards, RTS 2024-1773. I'm going to assume that, again, that you've all had at least one read of this. And this is just a revision, hopefully, no surprises. I've tried to summarize all in one page here for brevity. Article 1, and this is probably the biggest one, overall risk profile and complexity. If you're talking about third parties and you're outsourcing, the policy, I come back to it, it was in the Act as well, the policy becomes the main document. And all of the other articles, not all of them, but many of the other articles will refer back to the policy and what should be included in the policy. The services you will outsource and not outsource. What is acceptable to the organization to outsource, and what will you never outsource? Location, what locations are desirable, not desirable? Data, what data will you allow outside of your four walls, if you wish, or your organization? What's your policy on intergroup? And later, under conflicts of interest, they'll talk about ensuring that there's no conflict of interest. And there might be, you can imagine, in an intergroup where one part of the organization is supplying service to others, are you all treated equally? And this, better to spell this out in a policy and where it's unemotional and be clear where you stand. And of course, with outsourcing, maybe where you've outsourced to a third party and your competitors outsourced to the same third party, you need to be aware of what happens when. Do you need to know if the third party is regulated or not? And does it matter? And if they're regulated in the EU or not in the EU, consider that as part of in your policy. Concentration we covered. Transfer. I think that was about transferring maybe to another one, that you have arrangements in place. What if for whatever reason you're moving from one third party to another, and it could be because A is getting out of the business, so it's a managed, thoughtful transfer, or it's a sudden. We'll come back to that, I'm sure, in the testing. Group application, very simple. The parent ultimately is responsible for the application of the standards. Ultimately, governance arrangements. Like anything, it doesn't happen without good governance. The risk isn't managed unless you have good governance behind it, and that usually means the policies that we talked about that are updated annually, that there's methodology to this, processes, responsibilities, that's clearly assigned responsibilities, because if they're not assigned, it won't get done. The resources are made available, whether the resources are people or part of their time or systems, that wherever the reporting comes into, whether it's the board or maybe it's the senior management team, that you agree at the beginning, certainly before January the 17th, what are the reporting requirements? Do you need a report every month, every quarter? What is going to be in that report in terms of what do you need to know? Is it the incidents that have happened? Is it the number of third parties we have that have joined, have left? Any changes in services? There's no one rule, but you have to decide what is important for you and do that. Yeah, contractual arrangements consistent with other policies. Yeah, this is where when you start focusing on this one policy, it might be to the detriment of others, detriment in the sense that there should be a consistency throughout the organization. If you decided something is important, it may require you to modify other policies. Just be aware of that. Keep consistency in the organization. There's nothing like having two different voices, two different policies that are saying different things. Independent review, I think, yeah, depending on the size of your organization, that will determine whether you need to get externals in, but this is all part of the governance arrangements. Okay, Article 4 talks about the main phases of the life cycle for the adoption and use of contractual arrangements. In English, the life cycle of that third-party arrangement, where you source them, you set them up, you run with them, and then maybe later you exit that. Down to the decision making. And this, I think, is worth teasing out beforehand. How do you make a decision to go to outsource something in the first place? Then how do you make a decision to pick between one of several outsources? And if there is only one candidate and they're the only one in this, and it's concentration risk, do you outsource? All of this you need to consider, needs to be in the policy, back into the policy, but go through that life cycle. It'll inform the policy. You might have to do the life cycle and go back to the policy and add a bit into the policy. I think these are iterative things. Risk assessment and due diligence. Certainly, if you're signing up a new third party, you need to do your risk assessment of the risks that you now have to manage because of the decision to outsource. Or if you wish, if you're going to outsource, you can identify the risks and consider, is this something you can manage? Once you sign that contract, they're now on your risk register and you've got to manage them. So do the risk assessment beforehand, make a judgment, do due diligence, which will inform that risk assessment, the due diligence of the third party. I know these very well because I've filled out many of them. Some are very long and I would say unwieldy, but try and make it proportional to the task and what you're outsourcing. I think we've produced our own. If you need to do due diligence and you're looking for, give me 100 questions, I think we have a kind of 100 that will get you started anyway. Which certainly you need to know who you're getting into bed with. That's the essence of it. The controls you're going to put in place. Who's going to manage it? How often are you going to get a report? What information should be on that report? And then the register of information. This is the regulator needs a report, and we'll have a look at it in a moment, with all of the detail, because they're pulling it into one big, large database. It's very obvious from the format of the way they want the information that they're pulling it into a master database, so they can identify the critical third-party suppliers and apply even greater scrutiny to their operation. And then in here, and it keeps coming up, exit strategies. And there was a question a few weeks ago on that about testing those, and we'll come back to that later. Ex-ante risk assessment. I hate it when they bring Latin into it. There is a question in the chat. Maybe I'll ask Fiona to have a look at that and see if we should take it now or later.
I think we'll wait, Jerry.
Okay. Thanks, Fiona. What are the needs of the organization? Before you go and outsource something, what are the needs? What's driving this? And have you really exhausted all the possibilities of doing it in-house? And have you come to the conclusion, look, the only way we're going to be able to do this is to outsource? And then risk assess in several areas and mitigate those risks. Again, going into these things with your eyes open, because later to say we didn't know, who are you going to say that to? Your boss, the board, the regulator? Because the answer will be you're supposed to know. So do your due diligence. And then there's a whole article on that. It's a piece of string. As I said, I've got upwards of anything from, I'm going to say, 60 questions to 600 questions. But it's about reputation. You know, if reputation is important to you, then by getting into bed with a third party, you need to make sure that your reputation isn't negatively affected. So what is their current reputation and does it hold up? Their ability, can they do the job? Very simply. Again, no assumptions. Do your homework. What resources do they have? If you're going to be adding 50% to their business, will they be able to cope? 50% would be quite a lot. If you're just 5% of their business, then it's probably not as big a question. Information security, again, has to be up to speed, up to standard. Are they going to outsource? Are they going to do it all in-house? Again, you need to know. And I would say in the contract, you need to have a clause in there to say you must approve any sub-outsourcing. So it stays in your control. Where will the data be stored? In the EU? Which country? Multiple countries. Interesting that the Central Bank of Ireland in their report were looking for multiple countries. Well, the format would accept multiple countries separated by a semicolon, and the EBA are looking for one country per record, which developers hate when it's different. Okay, where am I? Where the data is stored. Can audit, again, that creeps into most of these, that you have the right to audit, you have the right to demand cooperation if it's required. Risk management, business continuity, you know, are they managing the risks? Have they got business continuity plans? The due diligence process itself, and how it's completed and how often it's completed, and if there's quarterly or annual, let's say, refreshers on it. Conflicts of interest, I think I kind of covered that. You know, are there any conflicts of interest when you're outsourcing to a third party that maybe competitors are outsourcing to, or maybe other divisions of your organization are outsourcing to, and they're like an intergroup? Does one of the entities within the group get more favoritism? How's the decision made, and is it objective? So you need to know where you stand if you outsource to an intergroup, where you stand in the pecking order, as it were. Contractual clauses, written audits, methods, document changes. Yeah, obviously everything should be written. I've no further wisdom really to add to that. Article 9, monitoring of the contractual arrangements. I'm looking at the time as well. Yeah, it's one thing to do a contract, sign off the contract, everybody signs it, and it's put in the filing cabinet. But you know, you have to be able to answer the question after. Let's say if it's coming towards the end of the contract, if it's for a year or 3 years, and you can't tell the board the performance and how well they've performed, and should we renew? That's the extreme case. I would imagine that you will have an opinion, but don't wait until towards the end of the contract. Do this on a, I'll say, regular basis. My experience, personal experience, was quarterly business review, that there was, you know, depending on the criticality, but at least annually, that you would review, is this contract going as expected? I think if it's the beginning of a contract, you probably would review after 3 months and 6 months to make sure that it's on track. But are you getting the performance you expected? Are there interruptions? Are there persistent, consistent interruptions? Because one interruption on its own might be small and short, but if these are regular and annoying, then you might say, hold on, we tolerated 1 or 2 in the beginning, but we expect now to have a high level of uptime. So if you're not monitoring it, how will you know? you'll only remember what's happened in the last 3 months. So I would say monitor reports, audits, and again, maybe your audits, you go in and audit, maybe they give you their audits, or they have a third party who do audits. Again, have it in the contract what's agreed. And if there are shortcomings, if there are errors and whatnot, have a process, that will fix that. Nothing is perfect, and just accept that it may not be perfect, but have a process to fix it, the shortcomings. And finally, exit and termination of the contractual arrangements. If I was on the board, I would say we have to have an exit plan. This is critical. The service that it's supporting is critical. So if we're getting out of the contract, or the third party is getting out of the contract, we need to have a plan. And we'll talk about the various ways of testing that plan. So finally, I didn't realize it would take me this long, but DORA is the Register of Information. Basically, the Act said that the European Supervisory Authority was to develop implementing technical standards. So what they've produced is the Register of Information. This is their graphic, not mine, but it's, if you were looking at it on an Excel spreadsheet, it's 15 tabs. The color here is giving you a feeling for the area. Green is contractual arrangement. The blue is the service provider identified, it says here. But let's have a look in maybe more detail. I tried to do a graphic of how this is, it's how we store the information and link it, that you have information on the ICT service provider. And this is just a sample. It's not all of the information, but the identification code, their name, because these are required in the report, in the Register of Information. Quite a lot of information is required on the service provider. And then you have the function, which I call a business service, which might involve multiple activities. You see here activity A, B, C, and D. And if it's a licensed activity in a critical function or service that is supported by a ICT third party, then it's included. That's what they want in the register. So there's a lot you might have that aren't included in that Register of Information. But you need that relationship between the third parties, the services you're providing, and the activities as part of that service. And a lot of the information on the financial entity is static information that doesn't change. So there's quite a lot of information they're looking for in the registers. Sorry. This is the first 9 tabs of that 15 tab, and the ones with the star I've identified as the static information. Contractual information, contractual arrangements, they're looking for some general information on one of these, and then specific information. You'll all have seen these. It's pulling it together. And I would say, from talking to customers, when you look at that and you look at these, it's a lot of information. And when you start to fill out this Register of Information, the thing that will probably shock you most is the gaps, the information that you don't have. You might have the start date of the contract, but you don't know the end date or the renewal date. You don't know the notice period. And is there a different notice period for you to give to them and them to give to you? And in the words of one of our customers, it's only when they started filling out the information that they realized how much they were missing. So start filling out the fields, if you were, and see what you're missing. In the last webinar, one of the questions we were asked is, how can calQrisk help? Well, we have developed, if you like, in the software, a place where you can store all the information, but it's getting it out into a report. And you can see here, this is just an excerpt out of one report, and the one at the bigger one at the back shows the information. You can see, for example, the type of services, ICT development, but in the one below it is what the regulator wants for that C60 is EBA_TA-SO2. Now, you could do a report with all these codes in it and nobody could read it, it's obviously going to be read by a computer. So what we've done is we've done both, so you can read the English and read that. But yeah, if you put in all the information into the system, it is a press a button and you've got your 15 tabs. But if you're a simple financial entity, that's easy. It's when you're then consolidating maybe several entities within the group. And then if you have multiple entities, and I'm talking, maybe 20 entities, and you're going to consolidate at the group level, it gets a little bit tricky. But first thing is the challenge for you guys between now and January the 17th, I think, is gathering all the information and to be able to put into the report. So I'm going to finish on these. My analysis, if you like, in summary of the third-party risk management is have a good contract, a robust contract. There's plenty of advice in the technical standards as to what should be in that contract. But if you have an in-house counsel, they've read that, and I'm sure you're well on the way to have a good contract. But you have contracts that were written 5-10 years ago. Maybe it's time to refresh those contracts. Again, your legal counsel will advise you on the best approach to that. I think
we take questions, Jerry.
We'll take questions. Yeah.
Yeah.
Sorry.
No, there are two, but the second one is more is related directly to the register. So we might take that one first. So this person is saying we have very few direct contacts with ICTs. Our parent signs most of the third-party contracts, and we have an intergroup SLA. Does this mean we have a much shorter list on the main page of the register?
That's an interesting one. Well, the group have the responsibility to do that return. And if they have all the information, the group is going to have to make that return. So if you don't have that information, you're feeding into the group and the group is going to make the return. If you have to make a return and it's a contract that the group has signed somewhere, then you need to know the details of that. If you have to make a return, there's certain details in that contract that you will need to know to be able to make a return. So I guess it depends on who's making the return, who has to make the return. But making a return on all the information that you've just been able to find, no, I would say, no, you have to go and find out. If you have to make a return, you have to find out the information. I mean, would you agree, Fiona, yourself?
I do indeed, yeah. Absolutely.
Okay.
So this question is very short, but it's a very big question. Have you got any advice for subsidiaries of a group based outside the EU? So I might take it.
Yeah, that might be one for you.
Yeah. So that question's been asked a few times to the EBA, and the Commission have made the decision that while DORA applies to EU entities, it does not apply, and this is financial service entities outside the EU, including branches. But if those branches are supplying you with critical support or support for your critical services, then it applies in that way. So that's just my initial thought on it.
Yeah, I think the key one there is that if it's a critical service, then anybody involved in any ICT involved in that is a dependency, like where you have a dependency in them, they're in scope. Is that the summary, really?
Yeah.
If it's part of a critical one, it's in scope.
Yeah. But if they're just, if you're a bank and you have branches outside the EU, then your branches aren't captured.
Okay. There's another one in there.
Yeah. So functions and activities. So Andrea would like you to be able to expand on this and give some real life examples.
Functions and sorry, I'll leave it on the takeaways here. Functions and activities. If the function, and that's the word the regulator uses, I prefer to use business service because it's a little bit ambiguous. So if the business service is fund management, there might be multiple activities as part of that service you're providing. So one might be the investment of clients' funds to make a return, and that's a licensed activity. But you might also be making transfers, lodgements or payments out of that. That's a separate activity. There's, I think, 123, it's sad that I would know that, but in the drop-down list of licensed activities. And so the full answer to your question is have a look at that drop-down. That is the full definition of all the activities. It's quite granular. But I think a business service can comprise of one or multiple activities. That's why I showed it as a one-to-many in that. Hopefully that answered Andre's question. There was a question that was asked a few weeks ago on, and we can cover this again when we're going to be talking about testing a few weeks, but on third parties. No, this was about exit strategies and about testing exit strategies. How do you test an exit strategy? I think the most practical way of doing this is with a desktop exercise, a scenario exercise, whereby you have a facilitator who leads the session. It'll last about 2 hours, generally these do, where the facilitator will say, you can take one of 3 scenarios, and maybe you do the 3 of them. The first one is, the service from our third-party provider has been intermittent. It is not meeting our required standards. We need to move, right? We need to exit. What are we going to do? So you do a what if. You said this is the scenario, and you kind of make it up and then work through that session. Now the facilitator can introduce problems. They'll have researched it and looked at what happened to other companies who've moved, and they'll introduce I call them curveballs, and you got to respond. But what will come out of that exercise is, okay, we need to update our plan and we need A, B, and C. You could have another scenario where you say, the third-party supplier has just had a major catastrophe. Lightning bolt hit the building is destroyed, and we need to move. We need to find somebody, and you've no notice period at all. And the third scenario might be that the third party comes to you and says, we're giving notice, we're getting out of this business. And and this is why the notice period in your contract is important. If they've got 90 days notice to give you, you got to find a solution, an exit strategy that works in 90 days. So again, do a scenario exercise where you're focusing on that particular scenario. And trust me, you will come up with, if you don't come up with at least a dozen things from each of these scenarios, then they weren't effective scenarios. So that was the answer to that question. We have still two minutes.
Okay. So we have 3
Fiona.
questions left, Jerry.
Okay.
2 are related. One actually was one we spoke about just before the webinar. But this person's asking, how do you deal with services provided by large organizations such as Microsoft? Ours was in relation to Amazon, but it's the same thing.
It's a good question, and we were talking about it just beforehand. Do you take Amazon or Microsoft? I think these large organizations have a number of things. First of all, they've certifications of compliance with ISO 27001, maybe SOC 2, various different standards that certainly will tick a lot of boxes for people, because they have been audited by independent third parties to get that accreditation. That might be enough for you. They have, like we're with Amazon, and Amazon have a disaster recovery, I would say, process procedure that we rely heavily on. But so if it's a case of they're hosting your servers, they can certify the environment. I think from my reading of the regulations, the concept of a pooled test, you're one of hundreds maybe of their customers who are looking for an answer to this, then maybe the answer is that there is an independent third party that goes in and audits Amazon, Microsoft, and I think these exist, and you will get that report from that audit. The only advice I would give is there's not one standard, there are multiple standards for what is audited, and you need to make sure that the scope of whatever shared audit that you're relying on covers your stuff. Okay, so read the scope before you read the results. Yeah, it's a tricky one, but I reckon the way it's going to be done is that there'll be independent third parties involved.
Mm. And Celine is asking then, can you apply proportionality to the ICT third-party service that's deemed to be in scope for DORA? For example, if we have identified a critical function and there's a dependency on a third-party service provider within that critical function, but it wouldn't cause the service to materially fail, can that TPS be excluded? Well, my short answer is no. And Jerry, if you'd like to expand on that one.
Well, if they're a dependency, they're included. But you can, I mean, is the service critical?
Yes.
Yes. There is in the form, in the third-party form, there is a field on the criticality. So you can put in those measurements and say, or the dependability. I haven't got it all in front of me. You know, the not dependability, the how critical, as you described it there, that you'd get by without them if you had to, and there's a space for that. In the form, so you can say yes, it's a critical service. Yes, this is a dependency, but we're not totally reliant. I think it's reliance is the one. Reliance on the third party, and you can say is somewhat reliant or something. There's three options. I don't have them in front of me, but you can actually report it like that, and therefore proportionality. You say that's why we're not too worried about it. We've identified it, but we have mitigation. If they were to go in the morning, this is what we would do. So yeah, that's what they want to know. That's they want that reassurance from you that yeah, you've thought about it and yeah, you can cope. Yeah.
And I guess it's, probably a good thing to say right now that our returns to the central bank they're going to determine who the critical service providers are from what we tell them.
I suppose critical in the sense that the ones that are highly dependent on them, they're not easily substituted. There'll be a certain category in there, won't there, that these are a lot of organizations relying on this organization and there's nobody else they can go to. Yeah. That's what they want to find out.
Yeah. So I know we've run over, there's still over 50 of us here. So we have two more questions. We might take them quickly.
Okay.
So on the slide for the ROI license activity, where that was mentioned, somebody's asking, can you clarify if you mean only ICT third parties involved should be recorded?
ROI license activity.
I think if you go back to the report.
This one?
Yeah, the register of information is the ROI.
Right.
License activity. So if you go to the actual report slide, I think, Jerry, it might be.
Yep.
And did you mention license activities in there? Anyway,
this is just one of 15, so the activity may not be on this. There's the type of service. That's not the activity one. That's our T0202. But the activity, they actually have the function. It's F1, F2. And if there's 4 activities, you'll have F1, 2, 3, and 4. But in this particular report, they're not asking for what the activity is. I think it's in another tab. I mean, I would say these reports aren't very much use to you as organizations. What I've done with customers, I've produced separate reports that show the relationship and in English, not code. This is purely for importation into another system. So not a very useful report to my mind.
Yeah. But I think to answer the question, for the register that we have to make a distinction between our registers of information and our third-party registers. So only your ICT providers are required for the register of information, whereas all of your suppliers go on to your
on your register
third-party register.
Third-party. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. I mean, I would even qualify it further if it has to be a licensed activity supporting a business service that's critical and dependent on a third-party ICT provider.
Yeah. And Hugh is here. Hello, Hugh. And he's asking Jerry, what about IT third-party service providers who insist on their own contract being signed up to and may not be EU-based? And he gives the example of Applied.
Gives the example of
Applied.
Applied.
Yeah. So I'm not familiar with Applied, but again, if
Well,
they're an IT third-party service provider.
I would go back to, and Fiona, if you've seen any advice on this, tell me, but the way the regulation is written, it's as if you're starting now to sign up third parties, and you can write all this in the policy before any contract is signed. But the reality is that most organizations have contracts signed already with organizations. And maybe if they were to start again, they'd write a policy that says we don't sign other people's contracts, they got to sign ours, or they got to sign ours as well as us signing theirs. So that point has passed. If you've got this, if it hasn't passed and they're insisting, you might have in your policy to say, we've no problem signing other people's contracts, but they got to sign ours. Yeah, it's a difficult one. I mean, how do you deal with that? I think that's the policy for the organization, and maybe there are certain red lines you won't cross. Maybe their contract is fine if it contains A, B, C, and D. I mean, I've certainly done that in the past, where a customer said they wanted to do their own to put our contract in as an addendum. Interestingly enough, because their contract kind of went above and beyond. But I think there's ways around it, and but if it's historical and if there are things in it that you can't agree to, then I would say you need to start planning your exit strategy, because ultimately the policy is set from higher up in the organization, and if they say we won't do these, then you got to ask the question: well, we've done this. Do we now exit, or do we? What does it draw a red line around it? What is it? What's the phrase? Square it off and say we won't do that again, but we'll live with this one. So it might have to be tagged. Yeah. Sorry, Hugh. No magic bullet answer then. All right. I think we'd better let people go. We've gone over, but hopefully it gave you some reassurance. And I'm saying that reassurance, not new knowledge, but maybe reassurance that you're on the way. The register of information, the sooner you get to start populating that, the sooner you'll know if you've got the information you need. That's, I think, where the pain is for most people. You've been doing a lot of this throughout the years. You just probably haven't gathered all of the information that the regulator is looking for. And yeah, best of luck with that. Okay. Thank you for your attendance. Thank you, Fiona, for your contribution and attendance too. And we'll see you again when is the next one? I wrote it down here. November the 26th in 2